November 19th, 1954. Sammy Davis Jr. was driving on a Los Angeles highway in the early morning hours, tired from a late show, but too energized to sleep. His 1954 Cadillac cruised through the darkness toward home. He'd performed at a club downtown, giving everything on stage the way he always did, leaving every ounce of energy in his performance. Now he just wanted to get home and rest before starting everything all over again the next day. The other car came out of nowhere. No warning, no time to react, just a sudden, violent collision that changed everything in less than a second. Sammy's car was T-boned by a vehicle running a red light, and the impact sent his automobile spinning across the highway. Glass exploded around him. The steering wheel drove into his chest. His head snapped sideways, his face striking the side window with devastating impact. When the wreckage finally stopped moving, Sammy Davis Jr. was bleeding and broken, aware in some primitive part of his consciousness that his life had changed forever. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They worked quickly, carefully extracting him from the wreckage, assessing injuries with the practiced efficiency of people who'd seen thousands of accidents in their careers. His chest was bruised and possibly fractured. His face was a mass of cuts and swelling, but his left eye was the critical injury, the one that made everything else secondary. The impact had driven his head sideways with such force that the eye socket had been damaged catastrophically. The eye itself was nearly destroyed, the damage so severe that even looking at it made the paramedics understand that this was a permanent injury. At the hospital, Sammy spent the first hours in shock that transcended physical trauma. Doctors worked on his injuries, stitching cuts, wrapping ribs, examining the damage to his eye with grim certainty that something had been permanently lost. His father arrived before dawn, his face a mask of controlled panic. Sammy couldn't see much from his right eye. His left eye was swollen shut, covered in bandages, hidden away in the clinical darkness of the hospital room. The ophthalmologist came in on day 2. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and the particular expression that comes from having delivered bad news thousands of times. He explained what had happened in clinical detail. The impact had damaged the eye beyond repair. The retina was detached. The lens was shattered. There was massive internal bleeding. Even if they could keep the eye physically present in his skull, it would never see again. The eye was destroyed, functionally, permanently, irreversibly destroyed. "We can try to save the eye tissue," the doctor said, not looking directly at Sammy, which somehow made it worse. "But I need to be honest with you. This eye will never see again. You're going to be blind in your left eye. That's a permanent condition. There's no surgery that will fix it. There's no medication that will reverse it. You need to understand that you're facing permanent, total vision loss in this eye." Sammy wanted to ask questions, but couldn't form the words. His face was swollen. His body ached. His mind was struggling to process reality. One eye, blind in one eye. Those were words that other people's lives contained, not his, not Sammy Davis Jr., who'd been dancing since he could walk. Over the next 36 days in the hospital, Sammy began to understand the full scope of what he'd lost. The eye wasn't just an organ, it was fundamental to his sense of himself. As a performer, as a dancer, as someone who moved through space with precision and confidence, the eye was essential. Depth perception, balance, the ability to judge distances, the ability to move across a stage knowing exactly where he was in relation to everything around him. All of that was compromised now. Visitors came during those 36 days, and they brought with them a particular kind of pity that Sammy found almost unbearable. Celebrities came, industry people, friends, family, and they all had the same expression when they looked at him, the same unspoken thought. His career is over. Not might be over, not probably over, but is definitely, absolutely over. On day 8, Frank Sinatra visited. He came alone, without photographers. He sat beside Sammy's hospital bed and looked at his friend with an expression mixing genuine concern with something else Sammy couldn't identify. Later, Sammy realized it was pity mixed with the beginning of distance. Frank was already distancing himself, already thinking about what it meant to be associated with a one-eyed performer. "You're going to be fine," Frank said, but the words felt hollow. The chief ophthalmologist delivered the prognosis on day 21. His name was Dr. Marcus Henderson, and he'd been performing eye surgeries for 43 years. He'd seen car accidents, industrial injuries, combat veterans with worse eye damage. But this case was different, because Sammy was a performer whose career depended entirely on two functioning eyes. "Let me explain what you're facing," Dr. Henderson said, sitting down beside Sammy. He had that tone doctors use when delivering bad news, the particular cadence that comes from having done this many times before. "The impact damaged your left eye beyond repair. The retina is detached. The lens is destroyed. There is permanent damage to the structures that would allow the eye to function. I can keep the eye in place and prevent infection. But your left eye will not see again. You need to understand that clearly." "What about in the future?" Sammy asked, his voice hoarse from not having used it much. "If surgery improves? If new techniques?" "No," Dr. Henderson said, and the finality in that single word made Sammy's heart sink. "There's no future technique that will recover vision that's been destroyed at this level of damage. This is permanent. You're going to live the rest of your life with monocular vision. One eye. That's what you have now, and that's what you'll have forever." Sammy looked away. Outside his window, Los Angeles was continuing on normally. Cars were driving, people were walking. The world wasn't stopping because Sammy Davis Jr. had lost an eye. The world didn't care. The world would keep moving. "As for your career," Dr. Henderson continued, and somehow this was worse than the medical diagnosis. "I need to be honest with you. Depth perception is critical for a performer, especially a dancer. You're going to have significant difficulty with the kind of precise movements that your profession requires. Many dancers with this kind of vision loss find themselves unable to continue performing at their previous level." "Many?" Sammy asked. "Not all?" "I can't tell you what you're capable of," the doctor said. "I can only tell you what your medical situation is. Your career, you need to think about whether it's realistic to expect to continue at the level you were working at before." What the doctor was saying, without explicitly saying it, was clear. Your career is over. Over the next 10 days, as Sammy recovered physically enough to be discharged from the hospital, he came to understand the full scope of what the industry thought. Studio executives called with what they clearly thought was appropriate sympathy. "We're very sorry about what happened, Sammy. We're going to put your contracts on hold while you recover. We want to give you time to heal and figure out next steps." What they meant, what everyone in Hollywood understood, was, "We don't know if you're employable anymore, and we're not going to waste money or risk our reputation finding out." Agents stopped returning calls with the same enthusiasm. Conversations that had once lasted hours suddenly became 3-minute exchanges, with excuses about needing to take other calls. Club owners who'd been competing for the privilege of booking Sammy Davis Jr. in their venues suddenly had permanent scheduling conflicts. Producers who'd been interested in casting him in films or television appearances suddenly became evasive. The industry was already moving on. The word was out. Sammy Davis Jr. was damaged goods. A one-eyed performer was a circus act, not a serious entertainer. His career, everyone understood, was finished. His father drove him home from the hospital on day 36. Samuel sat in the passenger seat, his left eye covered with bandages, his right eye seeing the world in a completely new way. Flatter, less dimensional, much harder to navigate. The streets of Los Angeles that he'd driven hundreds of times looked different now. Harder to read, harder to understand spatially. Even sitting in a passenger seat, even not driving, He could feel the difference in how his brain was processing the world. The spatial awareness that had been automatic was now complicated and uncertain. That night, looking at himself in the mirror for the first time since the accident, Sammy made a decision. He told his father, "I'm going back to work." His father stared at him like he'd suggested something impossible. "Sammy, the doctors—" "I know what the doctors said. The doctors said my career is finished. The doctors said I'm going to be a one-eyed performer and therefore not able to do what I did before. And the doctors are probably right about the limitations. But the doctors don't know what I'm capable of. The doctors haven't spent their entire life learning to overcome obstacles. The doctors don't know that I started performing when I was 3 years old. The doctors don't know me." What Sammy understood, in a way that the doctors and the executives and the agents didn't, was that he'd been solving problems his entire life. As a black performer in a segregated America, he'd been finding ways to perform in spaces that weren't designed for him. As a member of the Will Maston Trio, he'd been adapting to different venues, different audiences, different challenges every single night. Losing an eye was a catastrophic physical change, but it wasn't fundamentally different from the obstacles he'd been overcoming his whole life. He started working with choreographers while he was still healing. Before the bandages came off permanently, before he could see clearly from his remaining eye, before his body had fully recovered from the trauma, Sammy was thinking about how to move on a stage with one eye. He brought choreographers to his apartment. He worked through movements carefully, deliberately, understanding what felt safe and what felt dangerous. He worked with his father, who'd been a performer his entire life and understood the mechanics of movement better than most people. "You can't dance the way you danced before," his father said, not unkindly, but with absolute honesty. "So you have to dance a different way. Not worse, not diminished, different, better maybe." The answer wasn't to try to do what he'd done before and hope he could fake it. The answer was to fundamentally reimagine his performance. Sammy realized quickly that moving in straight lines required precise depth perception that he no longer had. But moving in curves, in arcs, in circular patterns allowed him to keep things in his peripheral vision. He learned to angle his body so that his sighted eye faced the direction he needed to look. He worked with musicians to adjust stage setups so that everything he needed to see was positioned within his functional visual range. He practiced for hours every day. He worked in his apartment, in dance studios, in any space where he could move and understand how his body related to the physical world around him. He fell several times. In misjudged distances, he walked into things. But each mistake taught him something new about how to move with one eye. More importantly, something fundamental happened inside him during this period. The trauma of the accident, the moment when he'd stared into the abyss of losing everything he'd worked for, the certainty that his career was finished, transformed him in a way that no amount of success could have. He started putting more emotion into his work. He started being more vulnerable on stage. He started understanding that audiences didn't come to see technical perfection. They came to see human connection. He realized that he'd been hiding behind his technical abilities. He'd been using precision and physical brilliance as a shield against genuine emotional vulnerability. Now, forced to accept that he couldn't be perfect, forced to acknowledge that he was damaged and broken, he was finally able to be real on stage. He could stop trying to be invulnerable and start being human. "I spent 20 years trying to be perfect," he told his father during one of their training sessions. "Maybe losing an eye is the thing that finally makes me a real performer." 11 weeks after the accident, Sammy Davis Jr. performed his first show since the crash. It was at a small venue in Los Angeles. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would make headlines if it went badly. His wounds were still healing. His confidence was shattered. His body was still recovering from the trauma. His left eye was gone, covered with an eye patch. And the permanent absence of it was something he still hadn't fully accepted. He walked out on stage, terrified. The orchestra was quiet. The audience was quiet. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see whether Sammy Davis Jr. could still be Sammy Davis Jr. without both eyes. And then he began to sing. What happened in the next 30 minutes was extraordinary. The audience didn't see a diminished performer trying to do what he'd done before. They saw someone who'd been broken and had refused to stay broken. They saw vulnerability transformed into strength. They saw a human being who'd stared at the possibility of losing everything and had chosen to fight instead. When he finished his performance, the applause was different than anything he'd experienced before. It wasn't just appreciation for technical skill. It was respect. It was recognition. It was the sound of an audience that had witnessed not just a performance, but a testimony to human resilience. Word spread rapidly through the entertainment industry. Sammy Davis Jr. had lost his eye and come back. Not just come back to do what he'd done before, but come back transformed, deeper, more authentic, more powerful. Over the next year, something remarkable happened. Sammy didn't just return to the level of success he'd achieved before the accident. He surpassed it. His performances became more intense. His connection with audiences became deeper. The disability that everyone said would end his career had actually become the catalyst for a complete transformation. He started talking about the accident openly. He didn't hide it or make light of it. He discussed it honestly as a pivotal moment that had changed who he was as a performer. And audiences responded to that honesty. They connected with the story of someone who'd been broken and had refused to stay broken. By 1956, 2 years after the accident, Sammy Davis Jr. was one of the most successful performers in America. He was performing in the major venues of Las Vegas, New York, and Los Angeles. He was recording albums that were climbing the charts. He was being recognized not just as a talented entertainer, but as a legend. The accident that was supposed to end his career had actually launched him into a completely different orbit of success. What the doctors hadn't understood was that Sammy's power as a performer wasn't ultimately about technical perfection or physical precision. It was about connection. It was about his ability to make audiences feel something profound, something true, something that touched them at a level beyond entertainment. Losing an eye couldn't take that away. If anything, the vulnerability created by the accident made that connection even deeper, more authentic, more powerful. He started talking about the accident openly in interviews. He didn't hide it or make light of it. He discussed it honestly as a pivotal moment that had changed who he was as a performer and as a person. He talked about the moment when the doctors told him his career was finished. He talked about the despair he'd felt. He talked about the decision to fight back. And audiences responded to that honesty. They connected with the story of someone who'd been broken and had refused to stay broken. They saw in Sammy Davis Jr. a reflection of their own struggles, their own moments when they'd been told they couldn't do something and had to decide whether to accept that verdict or fight against it. The eye patch became iconic. For the rest of his life, Sammy wore it with confidence. In photographs, in performances, in public appearances, the missing eye was visible. He made no attempt to hide it. He made no attempt to pretend that something hadn't been lost. Instead, he wore the eye patch as a statement. I've been broken, and I'm still here. I've lost something, and I've gained something more valuable. When young performers would approach him asking about dealing with disability, about overcoming setbacks, about the moment when it seemed like everything was finished, Sammy would tell them about the hospital bed and the doctors and the certainty that his career was over. And then he would say, I realized something fundamental. The doctors weren't wrong about my physical limitations, but they were wrong about what determines whether a career ends or begins. They didn't understand that the most important thing I have to offer an audience isn't my technical ability. It's my authenticity. It's my willingness to be vulnerable. It's my refusal to accept that limitations define who I am. By the time Sammy Davis Jr. died in 1990, the accident in 1954 had become almost mythological. New generations of performers learned about it. Audiences who'd never seen him perform in his prime learned about it through stories and interviews and documents. It became part of the Sammy Davis Jr. mythology. The moment when it seemed like everything was ending was actually the moment when everything was beginning. The catastrophe was actually the catalyst. The disability was actually the gift. The accident taught Sammy something that no amount of success could have taught him. That the most important performances aren't the ones where everything goes perfectly and you display technical mastery. The most important performances are the ones where you've been broken and you choose to perform anyway. The ones where you're scared and you choose vulnerability over protective armor. The ones where you understand that the audience isn't looking for perfection, they're looking for truth. Disability had transformed Sammy from a technically perfect performer into a legendary one. It had removed the barriers between him and his audience. It had forced him to discover that authenticity was more powerful than perfection. And it had created a story so compelling that decades after his death, people still talked about it, still learned from it, still understood it as a moment that changed what entertainment could be. If this story of a man who lost his sight and found his voice, of a performer who refused to accept that disability meant the end, of someone who transformed trauma into power moved you, make sure to like and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to remember that limitations don't define your potential, that setbacks can be the catalyst for transformation. Have you ever faced a moment where you were told you couldn't do something and you proved them wrong? Tell us in the comments. Hit that notification bell for stories about people who turned their greatest challenges into their greatest strengths.